Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all back to the Lennart Meri conference. It's the 6th conference that we organize and the 5th conference that takes place. I think ever since the ash crisis forced us to cancel one, we faced this double count. But I'm happy that we have all gathered here today. I'm especially happy that among us there are a few people who have been to all 5 conferences, and even some bravest who have been to all 6, even the cancelled one. So we have some news. The ICDS, meanwhile, has got a new director, whom I have pleasure of introducing you, Mr. Matthew Preiser.
Thank you. Thank you, Kadri. Thank you very much, dear Kadri. Thank you for an unbelievable and magnificent, typically magnificent job in pulling this amazing gathering together. Thanks to our whole staff, Puree and EP as well. I wondered how it was all going to come together, and then as we saw the lineup materializing of the guests and the topics, I know I'm a little bit biased, but it's brilliant. So thank you, Kadri, for your normal brilliance. You can't help it. That's the way you are. And for me, it's my first Lennart Meri conference. I have wanted to come for many years. I was unable to, thanks to my superiors at the State Department, who either told me I had to stay put, or that while I was pending confirmation, I wasn't allowed to go to any events. So I guess I wanted to come here so much that I figured I might as well try to become the director, and that would guarantee I would be able to participate. So thank you for that opportunity as well. Just a couple words about our vision, at least as the new director. I hope that we're going to be able to pursue a threefold purpose, which is one, to support the Ministry of Defense, our primary benefactor, in its own efforts to transform, to increase its efficiencies and restructure, to keep Estonia safe. Number 2, I hope we can help sharpen the focus of the Euro-Atlantic family on the security challenges and opportunities here in the Baltic and Baltic-Nordic region. And number 3, I hope by virtue of our efforts through conferences like this and our academic work, we will help the Euro-Atlantic community deepen its own appreciation of the contributions that Estonia, the other Baltic states, and Nordic neighbors make to Euro-Atlantic security. As I mentioned, this year's conference agenda is impressive. It's an ambitious intellectual effort to examine the future of democratic capitalism. And we actually span the globe in our outlook. We'll have discussions not only on the Euro-Atlantic region, but of course on China, on Iran, on the broader Middle East, on Afghanistan, and of course a lot of discussion of Russia. So thank you very much for being here. For those who have come from so far away or from just down the street, thank you again, Kadri, and thank you, Mr. President, for all of your support, your intellectual leadership, and of course your national leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. And with no further ado, I will hand over to Steve Erlanger, the moderator of our opening session.
Kadri, thank you. I'm Steve Erlanger. I'm the Paris bureau chief of the New York Times, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I don't know if we're going to settle the future of democratic capitalism, but the airlines are in trouble, I promise you. And I think we're all very lucky to be here relatively on time. It's a great pleasure for me to see so many familiar faces here and friends. And it's really quite a good group, I think. I'm, as always, very, very impressed with what Kadri's pulled together. And I'm sure many people will thank her before we're all done. But let me thank her now, because if it weren't for her, I probably wouldn't be here either. So what we have to begin with, I think, is a kind of keynote theme. It seems to me capitalism is under challenge, certainly. It's been under challenge for an awfully long time. I'm wearing my French socialist red tie in the new spirit. I don't know how much of a challenge François Hollande is to democratic capitalism. Not very much, my sense is. I'm not even sure he's much of a socialist. But when we look at what's going on in Greece, when we look at the protests Occupy Wall Street and Occupy everywhere else, when we look at the levels of youth unemployment, particularly in the Eurozone, where even in France, which I know better, but about 25% of young people are unemployed, and about half of the ones who are employed on short-term contracts or internships, something that feels rather vulnerable. So it's one thing to have a bright, shining generation future that's supposed to pay for all of us as we get older. It's another thing if we produce these children and can't give them jobs. We educate them and send them out into the world. We have a crisis of a sort of capitalism. Maybe it's becoming increasingly democratic in the Arab world. I mean, again, we have an extraordinary generational boom of young people, most of whom have a lot of trouble getting jobs. And frankly, in Egypt, certainly one of the biggest of them, the more education you have, the least likely it is that you'll actually get a job, or a job that's worth having. So I think that's a challenge as well to all of us. And then we have, to be sure, a challenge coming. One can overestimate this from Asia, from China, whatever you want to call it. China seems to be quite a fragile country, also under the pressures of creating the right kinds of jobs and the right kind of representation, so a society feels that it actually has some sense of mastery over its lives. But to some degree, this is a crisis of managed capitalism also. So it's a big topic, and we have with us, I think, a wonderful panel to help us discuss it. I'm just going to go through them and ask them to talk for 5 or 10 minutes, and we'll see how it goes. Then we'll have a bit of conversation among ourselves, and then open it up to all of you. So first, I've asked Heather Grabbe, who's the director of the Open Society Institute in Brussels, who's done quite a lot of work on the challenges of capitalism to kick us off. So Heather, please.
Well, good evening. It's a real pleasure to be back here in Tallinn. Well, we have a big topic in front of us. So I'm just going to start with a very small part of the world and a small set of issues, but one which is very dear to the hearts of many of us this evening, the small part of the world being Europe and the small issue being democracy. I've been coming to Tallinn for 15 years or so, and I can remember the early years coming to seminars sponsored by the European Commission on political criteria for joining the European Union and what European democratic standards really mean, what is stability of democracy, guaranteeing the stability of institutions, guaranteeing democracy, the rule of law, human rights, respect for and protection of minorities, and so on. I think we would have great difficulty holding such a seminar at the moment in Italy, quite difficult perhaps also in France, in Hungary, and a number of other countries, where there's a really strong contestation of both really what democracy is and also what capitalism is. Now we're going to spend the rest of this evening in a hangar for seaplanes. So it seems appropriate to start with something of a maritime metaphor. When you're in the middle of a storm at sea, it's very difficult to work out what is the immediate crisis, what is just the storm, and what's going to be the sea from then on. Or another way of looking at it, what's political weather and what's political climate change. So I think it would be useful as we just start out with this first panel this evening, just to try and distinguish what might be really a short-term consequence of the crisis in terms of democracy in Europe and what might actually be climate change. What are the things that are really changing in terms of the structuring of European politics? Now, at the Open Society Foundations, we've been doing some work under a small new program. Rather cheekily, my working title for it is iPopper, with a small I, which is kind of Karl Popper for the iPad generation. We'll see how we go before Apple sues us. I have a nasty feeling that they have some intellectual property there. But we've been doing some work on what's happening with populism in Europe. Not so much populist parties, but much more about the supporters of populism. Because it does seem that populism is part of the political weather. It's something that's cyclical, it comes up. Populists are, by definition, opportunists who ride popular waves, often of emotion, of anger, for example, of fear, resentment, humiliation. They take advantage of the circumstances, and they tend to blend into the political circumstances that they find. So they tend to mold themselves to the opportunities available. Well, whatever it is that they are benefiting from, they're benefiting from it on a very large scale in many European countries. And we recently teamed up with the UK think tank Demos to look at what the younger generation of supporters of populist parties really think and why they have been attracted to leave mainstream parties and join populist parties. We've done that in 11 European countries, not including Estonia, I regret to say, but my colleague Mal Hellam is working on changing that from the Open Estonia Foundation. We may well do a Baltic version of this survey. So what we did was, with Demos, was to survey the Facebook fans of populist movements, which enabled us to look at what the supporters really think rather than what the leaders of the parties claim their supporters think. And of course, it gave them a chance to have their say online. And it was very interesting what came out. First of all, these are on the whole not the losers, either from transition in transition countries or from the crisis. They tend to be, on average, more employed and better educated than the average voter. They tend to be male, they tend to be young, so sort of under 35, in some countries under 30 or under 25. And they're not anti-democratic. They're generally speaking in favor of democracy, and they are usually active voters. Some of them, of course, haven't reached the age of first voting, but most of them are quite active voters. Many of them formerly supported mainstream parties of either the left or the right. So it doesn't really matter whether they formerly supported left or right, whether they now go for a populist. And their main concern is about cultural identity. It's not actually about unemployment or austerity. It's about what kind of country they are going to be living in the future and what their children are going to be growing up with. Now, some of these concerns about cultural identity are, of course, about immigration. But quite a lot of them are about what on earth is happening to the country that I used to know. And they cite other issues as well, not just immigration changing the shape of things, but globalization and Europeanization changing the shape of things. For that reason, perhaps, they don't like the European Union very much. Only 14%, for example, on average, trust the European Union. And they see it as very remote. They don't really see the benefits of European integration in terms of ability to travel or even the economic prosperity it's brought. Instead, they tend to see it in terms of a set of distant institutions which has increased globalization, which has exacerbated the impact of globalization. Now, I just cite this survey because it's new data and it gives you a somewhat different picture from what you typically hear about populists, which is populists are right-wing xenophobes who are basically going to come and go with the crisis, and that will be the end of it. We've seen quite a lot of that sort of analysis following the French election, and the fact, given that about 1 in 5 French voters, nearly, voted for the Front National, and I think it's 1 in 4 voted for populist parties of right or left. But I think this picture is quite flawed because although it may be true that populists are simply riding a wave, that's the political weather which is actually indicative of climate change. It's the extreme political weather which shows you that there are underlying structural factors that are really changing. And I'll just give you a brief overview of some of the structural factors that seem to be emerging from recent research and surveys, and also some of the analysis, the more profound analysis that's being done in Europe now. One of the structural factors is economic policy is dying as a political choice. In which country do you really have a choice in terms of the economic policy as a voter that you can express an opinion on? Who are you going to vote for who really gives you a choice? Now, in the French election, of course, you had Mélenchon. He really did give a choice, and that perhaps is why he managed to get quite a vote. Marine Le Pen, well, she kind of at one point went for perhaps we should just leave the euro. In Greece as well, there are some extremist parties which have come up with views of let's abandon the bailout, let's leave the euro. But on the whole, mainstream parties are not giving a choice. Mainstream parties are doing policy without politics. It's just not happening. There's also a lot of politics without policy, in the sense that a lot of politicking about issues where there's no real policy change envisaged. I think a good example of this is, in fact, migration, where populist parties may complain a lot about migration. Not very many of them actually change migration policies in office. There are a few notable exceptions, for example, Denmark, where this has happened. But in most countries, what you get are a lot of slogans. You don't actually get worked out policies. And in economic policy, you very rarely get much at all in terms of a worked out program. And allied to that is, I think, another very profound structural change, which is left and right. What do they mean now? What is really a left-wing party and a right-wing party? Now, I'm sitting next to the former president of the Estonian Social Democratic Party and a former socialist, I think it was, MEP. And I would defy even experienced politicians of the left to find for me any real sense of a collective identity now between social democratic parties in Europe that is profoundly different from supposedly conservative parties when it comes to debates in the European Parliament. These are very broad churches, and there are certain supposedly right-wing parties, like, for example, the Swedish Moderate Party, which are way to the left of supposedly left-wing parties, like the British Labour Party. Left and right, partly because of...
Estonian Social Democratic Party.
Well, I'm not going to comment on Estonian politics. I think that would be most unwise. I'd like to stay for the rest of the conference.
I was commenting on Swedish politics.
Okay. But essentially, partly because of the fact that left and right used to be about economic policy, it's now very difficult to find very clear distinctions between right and left in terms of policy choices on issues beyond migration and some of the identity issues. And even there, it's a bit muddled when it comes to the mainstream parties. So left and right, I'm not saying they don't mean anything at all, but it's not something that it has a very profound meaning to many voters, which is why, of course, you have so many more floating voters and why you have so many more abstentions. Now, a further point of climate change, which is the one I'm going to finish on, is about how people relate to politics. How they actually identify themselves within the political process, and how they communicate about politics. Well, it's amazing that we did this survey on Facebook because we quickly discovered how much Facebook is the future of politics in Europe for many parties. About 50% of all internet time in Europe is spent on Facebook. And the Facebook site, the Facebook activity of populist parties is remarkably effective in garnering support. The mainstream parties have been much slower to make use of it. And people relate to one another on the internet in a rather different way from the way they used to relate to one another, also in terms of political organization. There's a process of disintermediation that's been going on with the decline in the role of trade unions, in student associations, in workers' educational associations, for example. There's a certain disintermediation of politics. And online politics has filled that space to some extent. It's difficult to know exactly where it's going to go, but certainly a lot of political activity is now there on the internet. And mainstream parties, it seems to me, are not taking full advantage of that in the way that their extremist and populist counterparts are doing. That really matters because people, when they are engaging in political activity on the internet, don't necessarily realize that they are in echo chambers. They are in a chat room where their views seem to be echoed and applauded by many, many other people. Now, in fact, this might be a group of only, say, 17 or 20 people, but it makes them feel as if they're in the majority of the population, that they have a majority view, they have a lot of people beside them. So it's actually quite hard for them to tell whether their views are more extremist or more mainstream. And that definitely affects the way in which they think about themselves and how they relate to politics.
That's a great start. Thank you very, very, very much. No, I mean, because we've got other people and we've got time. And I think we'll come back to this theme because one of the things that impresses me the most, I guess, about the French election, which I was covering, the two themes were anger and nostalgia, right? And on the left and on the right, the far left and the far right, you had quite a lot of anger. And the anger was, in part, this frustration with the sense that the economic system seemed like a sort of prison. In some ways, the euro can feel like a prison because it's the euro and the markets that, to some degree, limit the choices that you can make. And I think that's an important point that I really would like to come back to. Now I'm going to go to Guy Sorman, who is at the Manhattan Institute, an economist who's written about China and globalization. And maybe we can broaden it a bit outside Europe.
Sure.
Thank you, Guy.
First of all, Ida said that she's coming to Estonia since 15 years every year. So I want to emphasize the fact that it's my second visit to Estonia, and I was here in '88. And when I hear talking about the crisis of democratic capitalism, I don't think that Estonia is really suffering from a crisis in democratic capitalism. And on a really personal remark, I'm a great admirer of what has been done here. For me, it's a tremendous experience to be back here after having known this country under the Soviet occupation, and the way this country has been able, through democracy and capitalism, to save its culture and to save its soul, and to become a prosperous and a very open country. So democratic capitalism is not in crisis everywhere. It's certainly not in crisis here. And Estonia showed that democratic capitalism may be the solution. And maybe we want more of Estonia in Europe and less of Greece. Okay, so I want to do this opening remark, and also as I'm discovering the topic, because I didn't know really what we were discussing about, I will focus on some basic principles. And my first remark has to do with the very term of crisis. I don't know what would be a democracy or capitalism which would not be in crisis. Only stagnant society are not in crisis. The Western civilization can be defined by the very concept of crisis. We are in a permanent crisis since the very beginning. And it is because we are in a permanent crisis, and this has been explained by many authors and economists, I won't get into details, it's because we are in a permanent crisis that we are creative. And the countries which are not in crisis, or the countries which deny the notion of crisis, like China, for example, I say one word on China, and when they deny the very notion in crisis, when they always talk about stability, stability means stagnation. So in a way, it looks counterintuitive, but crisis is good, or crisis is us. The second remark, and it's a little bit to react to what the moderator said and what Eva said about populism. Because it's true that there is kind of a fear all over Europe. We see the rise of populism. And in the case of France, I would be very much tempted to add the far right and the far left, because those who are populist in saying no to anything. And it was based, as you say, maybe on anger, maybe on frustration, maybe on misunderstanding. But I really don't like the word populism. Because when you say populist, you act like kind of a superior person who knows the rules of democracy, and you kind of dismiss the people who are led, by their anger or frustration and are not able to, accept the rules of the game. But they maybe have some good reason not to accept the rule of the game. What I want to say is that populism is a translation of real problems. The people who are angry, they have some reason to be angry. The people who are frustrated, they have actual reasons to be frustrated. So I think it's very dismissive to replace an analysis of this political phenomenon by saying those are populist. Okay? Populism is real because the problems are real. What are the problems? I'll come back to that in one moment. More about democratic capitalism. And when I look around the world, what are the aspirations? What do the people want, after all? They don't say we want democratic capitalism. Okay? They say we want dignity and opportunities. And you mentioned the Arab revolutions, and when we were listening to the Arab rebels, they say we want dignity and opportunity. And what we have, if we do believe in the efficiency and the value, more ethical value and efficiency of democratic capitalism, we have to explain, and maybe we are not very good at explaining that democratic capitalism is the way to answer this query for dignity and opportunity. And which is also extremely striking and goes against the notion of crisis of democratic capitalism. When you listen to the people in the street in the Arab countries, when you listen, and I carefully listen to them, to the so-called Chinese dissidents and so-called Democrat activists, and Liu Xiaobo and Chen Guangcheng and all these people, what do they say? They say, we want democracy and we want free market. Recently I was in Beijing with a group of Chinese dissidents, and I explained this notion of capitalism, democracy being in crisis, and the reaction from the students, there were a lot of students say, we take the crisis if we get democratic capitalism in the package, okay? In a way, they understand better than we do. that crisis, democracy, capitalism, it's all interconnected, and they want the whole package. So this notion of democratic capitalism being in crisis, once again, is a perception, which has, of course, some real basis, I don't deny that, but from outside, the outsiders would really like to share our kind of crisis. Now, two more remarks on the so-called crisis of democracy and so-called crisis of capitalism. Why do we talk about both? Democracy. I think democracy is in crisis because people want more of it. And either made a very good remark in saying that one of the reasons why the populists are so frustrated is because they have the feeling not to be able to make a real choice. So in a way, what they want is more democracy. In the case of Europe, it is clear that Europe is not organized as a democracy. So I think the answer to the so-called crisis in Europe is more democracy, a real parliament making decisions, real election, real government, in a way, a federalist Europe. I think the answer to the frustration of people who are hostile to Europe is because they have the feeling that Europe is not democratic, it's technocratic. So the answer is not less Europe, it's a more democratic Europe. This would be my take on the crisis of Europe and democracy in Europe. More of it and not less of it. And now a final remark on the crisis of capitalism. It's a crisis which has to do with globalization, actually. I mean, capitalism, like socialism, like communism in the time of Stalin, it was a communism in one country. And capitalism, since the Middle Age until now, was very often capitalism in one country. And today, capitalism in one country doesn't work anymore because we have globalization. And the problem, which is real, is that we don't have the institution, certainly not at the European level. We don't have the institution at the global level to find the right coherence between globalization and capitalism. We still have to organize the free market at a global level. We don't have the institution, the analysis is very poor, and also, I mean, the kind of analysis which are proposed usually are less free market for a better globalization. This doesn't work. This doesn't work. So my conclusion is that democratic capitalism is in crisis. Thank you for that. This will force us for a more in-depth analysis. Populism is rising. They have good reason to be frustrated. And we have not been able so far to give the proper answer. Oh, and I wanted just less than a minute. I think one of the major problems in the free market society today, and this is true in Europe, this is true in China, this is true in the United States, that we have what Jacques Chirac in 1995 called la fracture sociale. All capitalist society, all free market society are really divided now between the people who can cope with globalization because of their education, because they know the rules, and the people who cannot cope with the globalization. And this is a real problem with which no government today has been able to propose an answer. Thank you.
Merci, Guy.
Merci à vous.
One of the things that fascinates me, of course, is almost a contradiction, because every time Europe goes into crisis, everyone says, oh, well, that means we need more Europe rather than less Europe. But the angry people don't want more Europe. They've made that very clear also, partly because it's not democratic, but also because it's transnational and it feels a sort of European metaphor for globalization. I mean, people who are worried about Romanians and Poles coming in and taking their jobs, or French companies, for instance, building dachas in Bucharest and not building them in France, we don't really have an answer for that. And I'm not sure more Europe, though it seems to make sense to have a European Treasury Ministry, blah, 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 is actually going to be very popular if we put it to the democratic test. But we'll see. I think it's important. It's always very odd to introduce the president of his own country, President Ilves, who I've known for a very long time and respect tremendously. And he graciously ordered me not to have him go first. So I've graciously decided to go along with his command. But he's very willing to come ahead now. And I'm very curious, you know, just to see your perspective on this, because Estonia's come such a long way. It's made such a bet on this Europe and on this euro and so on. And does it feel like the right bet? That's one of my questions, I suppose. But Tom, please.
Let me begin. I think we shouldn't confuse categories here. I mean, one is we're talking about populism in Europe. That's one issue when we talk about the crisis of democratic capitalism. And then we look at the world, and then we're looking at sort of various alternative models. I mean, something that calls itself democratic capitalism, but is actually, would be better termed autocratic kleptocracy. But Lilia Shevtsova and Andrei Pionkovsky can talk better about that without mentioning where it takes place. But I mean, what I think the first thing we start off with is that while there may be a crisis, I think what Francis Fukuyama's observation is always worth keeping in mind, that everybody wants to say they're democratic. I mean, you can even install 500,000 video cameras in polling places to show your elections are democratic, even though, you know, forgetting that it was in fact Joseph Stalin who said basically what matters is who counts the votes, not how you actually vote. But anyway, everyone wants that fig leaf. So that's the ideal. And then those countries that have achieved it now seem to be whining and complaining about it not working. But the countries that are clearly not democratic, nor are they capitalist in the sort of the level playing field, liberal market economy sense, also claim to be capitalist. On the world scene, I think there are some interesting paradoxes. We have seen in the past year and a half a rejection of the Ba'athist nationalist socialist model that dominated the Middle East for, since the 1950s. I mean, that's a long time. It's almost as long as Soviet communism, and it was the dominant ideology in the Middle East was, you know, basically the sort of the Nasserite approach. That's collapsed. The paradox is at the same time, if you look at, here I did in the first minute, Freedom House's sort of report on democracy and freedom in the world, the number of countries that actually experience freedom has decreased. So, I mean, on the one hand, people have rejected this authoritarian model, yet we're not getting any better. I mean, I'm going to just leave that paradox there, but I think it's something we should deal with. It does seem in the last several month or two that the Chinese model seems to be cracking, but I'm no expert on that. Guy can probably talk more about that in the follow-up discussion, but certainly you know, the fundamental issue that democracy, real democracy satisfied, which is an orderly transition of power. You don't leave feet first. You don't pass it on to your son or daughter. This is, I mean, you do in some places still, but in China, the solution they found, which is different from having free and fair elections, seems not to be working. And it's a very complex sort of a system they've devised there, but it's not working. So I think that, you know, democracy is still rather au courant, and people do want it. I always found it a little patronizing, if not to say obnoxious, that when that the European Commission and others would come to a country like Estonia as if we were supposed to, as if we didn't want democracy and we didn't want market economies. I never understood those seminars, you know, democracy good, communism bad. You're telling the Estonians? Give me a break. But anyway, that's the way it was back then. And now, so I think that when we look at the world situation, I mean, I think the desire to have a democratic government and have a democratic free and fair elections, respect for human rights, civil liberties, and so forth, is very much on the agenda, and that was what drove everything we saw in the last year, or at least a large part of what we saw in Northern Africa. It's what drives people in Belarus and Ukraine. Just quickly, I should say that last year when I made the introductory speech, I pointed out that Andrei Sannikov was in jail in Belarus. He was another participant in this conference every year until last year as the presidential candidate, and he was in jail. He's now out of jail. We would have liked to have seen him here, but he's apparently not really allowed to travel. So democracy is not doing that well, even very close to us. I just mentioned that so we know that he's a fellow participant, at least in spirit. Now, to get to the Europe issue on populism, I really don't like the discussion on populism that's been going on so far, because it tends to be, populism is what the sort of the little funny parties are doing, and they're not us. But I would argue that if you look at the fiscal policies of a number of countries in Europe for the past 25 years, it was raw, obnoxious populism. 14th-month salaries, basically, I have a whole essay on this, I'll pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. That model of staying in power by just borrowing money and distributing it clearly is now reached payday or payback time. And that's not working. But I would argue that those official politicians, members of the socialist and EPP families, and they were no less populist in completely irresponsible fiscal behavior from the kind of funny parties that today we call populist. I would further talk about what is populism in fact today. It is so different. I would argue that at least when we hear some of the more ventilating discussions of populism in Europe, that they're actually looking at rather a call for responsibility. I find the analogy historically 500 years ago in Germany, when in fact a very clever politician named Martin Luther seized upon seized upon an entire population getting very angry with following the rules, tithing 10%, having one wife, and then seeing the money from their tithes that went down to Rome coming back with priests covered with gold and brocade and with their mistresses, saying, wait a minute, we're paying for this, we're following the rules, those guys are coming up here, we don't like this. If you look at the pre-Luther, but just before Luther, cartoons that after Gutenberg in the printing press started circulating in Germany, that sentiment is there before Martin Luther started hammering anything on any doors. Martin Luther was the clever person who said, aha, this is a widespread sense of the way things are. Calvin did the same thing. And I would argue what we're seeing in Northern Europe today, in those populist movements, is a complete rejection of this idea of pay us, bail us out, but rather we've had enough of, we follow the rules. And so, all kinds of things can be said about parties like the True Finns in Finland. They're certainly not one of my favorite parties, but aside from an occasional statement from True Finns, which are, borderline xenophobic, in general, these are rather people who follow the rules, and they don't want to see the things continue the way they are. And since I don't want to talk for too long, I'll just say I think we have a larger problem here. I think those so-called populists are a manifestation of something broader, which is that a failure of the EU institutions today to actually match reality, the failure of the legal treaties having anything to do with reality. Because, in fact, if you look at the 17 members of the Eurozone, the fiscal responsibility within that, where you are obligated by law, you have ratified treaties in order to, which say that, 3% deficit, 60% indebtedness. Well, the range in Europe is completely filled by the Eurozone, from the least responsible with 152% of GDP in debt and the highest in deficit to the least indebtedness in Europe and probably one of the smallest deficits. We're under 3%. Anyway, I won't mention which country has follows the rules the best, but take a guess. However, that's the institutional arrangement, and we have the whole span there, as far as it goes in either direction. But if you look around the north of Europe, there we have countries in the Eurozone, Finland, Estonia, Germany, the Netherlands, and they're following the rules. And then we have countries outside the Eurozone. We have Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Sweden, and Denmark, and they're following the rules. So you have this, we're at complete cross purposes. The institutions mean nothing, and yet this is the core of the European Union. And if you go back to what is the primary point of developing democracy, is developing the institutions. That's the whole discussion of democracy development, is we need strong institutions. And I would say in the European Union, there is an institution, but it just doesn't exist on paper, but it's kind of the attitude of fiscal responsibility followed by those in and out of the Eurozone, and then there's an attitude of, we're in the Eurozone, who cares? We don't have to do anything. And I think that's a very dangerous situation. And I'm not going to say any more about what that could entail, but certainly I think if it is not, to quote the development language, it is not sustainable to have an institution have no meaning whatsoever and at the same time have a competing organizing principle which has nothing to do with the institution. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. I'm also struck, I have to say, by Greece, but also talking to friends in Spain in particular, which really feels very, very vulnerable. You have a kind of race between austerity, if you want to call it that. You could call it adjustment, and democracy. I mean, can there be political legitimacy for the kind of program being imposed on democratic governments from the EU, Troika, IMF, ECB? I mean, with all the goodwill in the world, is there really, it's not just a democratic deficit in Europe. Sometimes I think when you're in those countries, it feels like a dictatorship more than anything else. I mean, it's an imposition and a forceful removal of sovereignty in the name of not being bankrupt.
Well, I would just quickly.
Please.
Quickly.
No,
well,
please.
if you go around, I mean, if you've been in power via democracy, I mean, in democratic elections, because you keep using other people's money to keep your electorate happy, I'm not sure that's real democracy either.
Well, it's, yeah. It's not very responsible. I don't know if it's undemocratic. Anyway, David, head of Freedom House, studies democracy, capitalism, compatible, troubled? What do you think?
Well, first, Steve, let me thank Kadri for putting on another terrific conference this year. And Tom, thanks very much for hosting us. And thanks for mentioning
plug.
Freedom House. Yes, I appreciate that. You mentioned the decline that we've seen in democracies. Freedom House does surveys on freedom in the world. It's been doing it since 1972. We rank countries on whether they fall into the free, partly free, and not free category. And if you look back, say, 30 years ago, there were 54 countries that fell into the free category. In our latest survey, there were 87. So there is a clear growth in democracies around the world. There's no question about it. But just because countries become democracies doesn't mean you can take for granted that they will remain democracies. And one of the biggest challenges I think we face around the world is consolidating the democratic gains, and we have seen backsliding in a number of countries. In our latest report, we saw declines in 26 countries around the world and gains in only 12. The decline that you referred to, Tom, for the 6th consecutive year, we have seen a democratic decline around the world. This is the longest decline since we've been doing the survey in 1972. It's not a radical decline, but it does underscore the problem and challenge we face in consolidating democracy. 43% of the world's population is living in countries that we would describe as free. 22% is deemed partly free. 35% of the world's population lives in not free countries, and not surprisingly, a little more than half of that is from China. The biggest development, I think, that we saw obviously took place in the Middle East, North Africa, in the past year and a half. And what I think was perhaps the most important development that emerged from that was removing this myth that many people had that the Arab world wasn't interested in living in a more democratic environment. And I think what we saw from Tunisia to Egypt to Libya to Syria, Bahrain, Yemen, and on, as Guy mentioned, this was largely about dignity. It was largely about respect for human rights. It was expressing outrage and frustration with massive corruption that took place. And I would argue that the kinds of regimes that I just mentioned are by definition corrupt. Authoritarian regimes are corrupt by definition. And we saw finally in these countries the frustration reaching a point where people said enough and they wanted change. And obviously the outcomes of these, what I would describe are awakenings, perhaps more than revolutions or uprisings. Awakenings is still not clear. It's much too premature to come to any conclusions about these things. I would even say in Egypt, a country that I have spent more time on than I would like to, frankly. My office was one of those that was raided on December 29th by Egyptian authorities. And the picture in Egypt is obviously not a pretty one. But a Pew survey just came out the other day, and 2/3 of Egyptians believe that democracy is the best form of government. But to reflect the contradictions that we see in Egypt, a majority of Egyptians also view Saudi Arabia as the model to follow. Not quite sure how one squares that. But nevertheless, there is strong support for the April 6 movement, which is a secular, more liberal movement. The Brotherhood is just ahead of the April 6 movement. But the Salafists are way down on the list. And so even in a place like Egypt, I would argue it would be a mistake to say that democracy is hopeless there. What happened, I would argue, is that the head of the snake was removed, but the rest of the snake is still wiggling around and wreathing. And I would also argue that the SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the intelligence services there, essentially hijacked the revolution of what so many people came out in Tahrir Square to try to push for. Tunisia is a country where we have seen the greatest gains. And I think one of the major changes is almost silly to compare Tunisia and Egypt. But in the case of Tunisia, the armed forces and the security services didn't stay in charge. They turned things over to civilian authorities. And I think that's one of the keys as countries go through transitions in order to try to bring about greater accountability and rule of law. It's to turn things over to civilian accountable kinds of government rather than to have militaries run things. We also came out with a Freedom of the Press survey in last week, I guess it was. And in that survey, we also recorded that we are at the lowest levels since in over a decade, rather, with people living where there is a fully free press. Only 15% of the world's population live in countries with a free press. And a free press, I would argue, is one of the key ingredients to democratic development because it holds governments accountable, it exposes abuses and corruption, and as long as you have governments going after, or not just governments in some cases, certain syndicates and other groups going after the press, then I would argue you're going to have problems not just on the democratic front, you're going to have problems on the market economy and capitalist front. And lastly, the issue of corruption, and Tom and I have talked about this a lot. I think for some of these countries, it is their greatest export. I would argue that you didn't want to name the country, but from Russia, corruption, I would argue, is the biggest export from Russia these days. And it's a threat. It's a major threat. It's a threat to Europe. It's a threat, less so to the United States, but even to the United States. And it's something I think we need to be prepared for. Guy and I talked very briefly before in today's Herald Tribune. There was this front page story, the China model loses some of its luster. I think I've never been one who's thought that China offered a model for other countries to follow, but I think what you're seeing unfold there with the Beaujolais case in particular is a reflection of a government that is ruled in an authoritarian way through corrupt means that suppresses its population, and it may take decades, but over time, that kind of system of government is not going to prevail.
David, thank you. I'm not surprised, but I'm intrigued that you didn't mention Libya, which seems to me a place where we've all gone to a lot of trouble,
Sure.
which is a complete chaos. I mean, Colin Powell used to say, if you break it, you own it. And the new principle seems to be, if you break it, we're good at breaking things, we'll just leave the pieces in the desert
Yeah, but
and see what happens.
We didn't break it. Gaddafi broke it. We actually went in to save people. We did the right thing. I would argue it wasn't just for humanitarian reasons that we needed to intervene in Libya. It was Libya's importance in the context of going from Tunisia to Egypt to Libya and elsewhere. Because if Gaddafi had been able to staunch the momentum, that would have been a big setback, not just for Libyans, but for everybody in the region.
Yeah, I'm willing to accept most of that, but not for here. It's just I'm struck by the failure of the same coalition that went to war on behalf of one part of the Libyans to do much to help them get out of what they're into other than keep buying their oil. But I'm intrigued by one thing. I just want to come back to the panel, particularly Heather and David or whoever wants. I mean, there was always this assumption, certainly when I was in Moscow as the old system fell apart, that it was almost a kind of magical thinking that, capitalism would bring forward democracy because capitalism would create interest groups and a middle class and people who wanted law and needed the protection of law, and that it would just kind of flow. It wouldn't be fast, it wouldn't be pretty, but we would actually kind of create a middle class that wouldn't be willing to be bought off. And I'm curious whether you feel that was simply wrong, or just Putin's been too clever, or this whole notion of managed capitalism, which one can see it in lots of different ways. I mean, it doesn't, it promotes sometimes unrest and unhappiness, but not necessarily, but perhaps I'm wrong, a movement toward an actual democratic system. So I'm curious, Heather, and then Guy, anybody.
Very short answer to that. I mean, what you're just alluding to with the Huntington hypothesis.
Yes.
Huntington explained 30 years ago that when you reach a certain plateau, a certain level of income, then you become a democracy. The Huntington hypothesis has not been proven. It's probably wrong. So what political scientists and economists think about the topic now is that the two concepts are completely different, and there must be a connection between democracy and capitalism, but we don't know what it is. And it has never been demonstrated. And the other remark I want to make that when we associate democracy and capitalism and we invent this concept of democratic capitalism, it's not accepted everywhere. And because they are on different levels, democracy is legitimate as such. As the president said, even in non-democratic countries, the despot or the dictators pretend it is a democracy. So democracy is legitimate, and there is no debate about that. And Fukuyama was right on this, that every country wants to get there, even if it don't get there. Capitalism is not intellectually legitimate. Nobody loves capitalism. Let's be frank, okay? Capitalism is tolerated as long as it delivers the goods. So democracy has not to prove its virtues. Capitalism has to prove that it can deliver the good. So we have to consider the two things separately. We are fighting for democracy because it's ethically just, and we have to make capitalism more efficient. So it's not the same struggle. It's not the same cultural debate, and we have to pursue the two objectives in different manners.
Thank you. Heather, do you want to?
I agree with Guy that the relationship between democracy and capitalism is complicated, and one does not necessarily give rise to the other. And we can think of plenty of examples where you've had democracy with a fair degree of central planning, and you've also where you've had capitalism without very much democracy, China being an interesting example of this. But what's very clear is both require, in order to thrive, both require institutions and the rule of law. And the rule of law is perhaps even more primary than establishing procedural democracy, because rule of law is what gives substantive democracy, and it also allows for enforcement of contract, which is absolutely vital for capitalism. Now, what we've seen in many systems which have set up a procedural democracy, which has elections which might initially even be quite free and fair, is that institutions get captured if the rule of law is not instituted at the same time. So the rule of law essentially says everybody is equal before the law and everybody has to obey the law, and the law is something that is agreed among people. And this, you see this from the theories of justice of John Rawls, also the way in which Amartya Sen has written about it more recently, that in any system where the rule of law is not instituted properly, it's very difficult to have either. And I think that's where a lot has gone wrong. A lot of it has gone wrong in Russia, for example, perhaps also in Ukraine. You might even argue in some of the EU countries, where the political culture did not allow for everybody to be equal before the law, where people could squirrel money abroad into tax havens, both onshore or offshore, where people could grant themselves immunity from prosecution in various ways, from the way in which people were able to avoid court cases by muzzling the media. I mean, I think your point about media freedom is absolutely vital, David. If you don't have those institutions which protect freedom of the media, which protect also enforcement of contract, then you're not going to have either of them. And I think that's really the biggest failure that we now see, and is the reason behind the big changes that the Freedom House Index, the Pew Research, and others are showing, is that the respect for institutions, the upholding of institutions, if it's not properly embedded in the political culture, it doesn't work. And it shows that EU membership does not guarantee it. There are founding members of the EU that now have technocratic governments, basically because it hasn't been possible to enforce, to hold the institutions accountable in any other way, to actually make them work. Now, technocratic government is not democratic, and yet it might be the route back to democracy. The question is, what way is that route now going to take? It's very difficult to see it either in Greece or in Italy.
David, did you? And then, Tom, David. Yeah.
Well, I think we'd agree, actually, the sine qua non is rule of law. I mean, would you say the UK, was democratic in the 19th century? I mean, it had rule of law.
It was getting there.
But, I mean, you didn't have universal suffrage. I mean, you had property-based suffrage.
But if you don't have rule of law, you can't have
Right. I mean, and that's my point. And the problem when it comes to rule of law is that it's not just the sort of occasionally pedantic Estonian approach to rule of law, which is basically exactly what's in there. But, I mean, lack of respect for rule of law leads to things such as the prime minister of a large country I shan't name, former prime minister, who basically had the law changed so that it would be, the statute of limitations would be limited, and that was the only way Europe got its arrest order. And if you know European history, you know who I'm talking about. Anyway, but he's no longer prime minister. But the point is, that's sort of,
He's still not being prosecuted.
But I mean, you change the law so he would not be prosecuted. You change the statute of limitation, and then everything's okay. But I think this respect for law, respect for the rules, has collapsed in Europe precisely looking at the stability and growth, or the Maastricht criteria, where we whistle on these. I mean, I think there's a big cultural difference here, that there are those people saying, look, we signed an agreement, we ought to do this, as opposed to those that we signed an agreement, now we have cheap money.
David.
Steve, you asked about Russia, and Andres may want to disagree, but I think had the price of oil not gone up the way it has under Putin, we wouldn't be talking about Russia as an economic power. It was, I think, about $15 a barrel, Anders, roughly, when Putin became president. And the last I checked, I think it was 112. So external factors have an enormous amount to do with Russia's economic recovery. But the level of corruption is so massive in Russia, where it's the local cop shaking down a motorist, the local official demanding a bribe from the enterprise. The governor, because he's appointed by the Kremlin, is beholden to the Kremlin, not to the population. People have had enough. And September 24th last year, I think, really capped that. Just very quickly, picking up, this is from the IMF's World Economic Outlook. Of the 50 fastest growing economies based on percentage growth of GDP through 2016, only 4 are considered free in the top 20. And of the ones in the 50 category, most are in the not free category.
No. Sorry, I have a methodological objection. Because the growth rate means nothing, because you have to consider from what level you start. So when Japan is growing by 2% a year, the Japanese become more wealthy than the Chinese who are growing by 10% a year. So I disagree with the methodology of the IMF once again.
All right, fine. There we are. I would like to open this up now for questions, if I could. We've got about 20 minutes, I think. And I'm hopeful what we've been gassing on about will spark your interest. I see a hand in the front row there. And if you could please, even if everyone knows who you are, introduce yourselves.
My name is Sameh Saif El-Yazal. I'm the chairman of Al-Gumhuriya Center for Political and Security Studies in Egypt. Being an Egyptian, and I've heard several issues about Egypt, I thought I have to comment on that.
Please.
Sure. I may not agree completely about what have been said, but I disagree with Mr. Kramer for two issues. Mainly, the saying that Egypt will adopt the Saudi example for democracy. I think it's not fair to say that. Number one, yes, we do have an Islamic wave now in Egypt, headed by Muslim Brotherhood. But in this case, and which they have a candidate running for presidency, I doubt it very much if he will win, hopefully. But anyway, that's what I feel. I just came from Egypt yesterday. And by the way, we started already the procedures of the elections today. So Egyptians abroad actually started to put their votes in the polls as of today for 6 days. And then we go for our polls inside Egypt 23rd and 24th of this month. Back again to the point, I don't think they will win. But even if they win, even the Turkish model, the Indonesian model, Iranian models, and the Saudi model definitely will not be implemented in Egypt. The Egyptians will have the Egyptian model. And I can assure you of that. Forget about the small number of people which are supporting Muslim Brotherhood, but doesn't mean that intellectual people and the normal people in the street out of Muslim Brotherhood will support that. This is number one. Number two, SCAF, Supreme Military Council. I think personally that they did a very good job. And what happens actually from them, that they protected the revolution. They didn't do just like the Libyans did, killing people. Syrian did, killing 11,000 people up till now, innocent people. So in fact, they protected the revolution. Moreover, they don't have any interest to stay in power. They're leaving on the 30th of June, and they announced that. I'm sure they will leave. And they will not actually be involved directly or indirectly in the political life of Egypt anymore. So from my point of view, they did well. Last point, I think we do have a very good future coming in front of us. The Egyptians are very serious and willing to have democracy and to practice democracy. Yes, we do have kind of instability now, which is normal after the revolutions, but I think you will see another Egypt, not because I'm Egyptian, but because I live there, and it's my job to monitor that, because I chair a big think tank in Egypt, one of the largest think tanks in Egypt, and I monitor day by day what's going on. Thank you very much.
Shukran Akhtir. Okay. Let us take just one or two more, please. I see someone there, and then there's someone in the back. So you first, sir, and then you.
Thank you. James Sher from Chatham House. If we had at the beginning introduced the distinction between democracy and liberal democracy, I wonder how different the panel discussion might have been. Democracy without liberalism is not only coercive, it can be frightening. And I was surprised that this distinction was largely absent in the discussion that took place about events in North Africa. By the same token, I'd like to question the equation made between corruption and authoritarianism. Surely one of the greatest mobilizing potentials of movements like Hamas and a lot of radical Islamic movements is that they are fanatically hostile to corruption. By the same token, we'll find that some of the Russian opposition has been particularly successful by drawing together constituencies that are militantly hostile to corruption, but also grounded in ethnic Russian nationalism, which is a much more menacing thing than the sort of Russian nationalism that Putin espouses. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then, gentleman right in the back, just lift up your hand if they're perfect. Thank you. And introduce yourself again.
Thank you. François Jay from France. I would like to make two comments. First, about the notion of model. I'm really skeptical about this idea. I think that if you look at the past, we had a democratic socialist model, which has proved what it became in history, a major failure. Now we have principles of democracy put forward by a number of countries in the West, like France, like Great Britain, like the founding fathers in the US. The problem is that here we have principles. And in our societies today, the real problem is the gap between those principles which remain respectable and which can inspire a number of countries, government, and society. But at the same time, the practice of the government is diverging from those principles. We have too many cases of corruptions in Western countries. We have too many cases of affairs. We have too many cases of relationship between the government of democratic countries with authoritarians and totally corrupted government outside the world. And finally, I would stop by saying that this notion of model was touched upon almost 80 years ago by the man who remains the most prominent figure in China, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who in four conference given in 1924 and 25 presented the principles of democracy in the West and tried to find out the principles for Chinese democracy, making clear that a number of values provided by thinkers in the West were acceptable but should be adapted to the very nature of Chinese society, of the culture of China, of the tradition of relationship between the individual, the family, and the state.
Right.
And then we had still the possibility to consider that we are not the model, but we can inspire other models and cooperate with them.
Thanks. You. That's good. I think Lee Kuan Yew tried to do the same thing later. Does any of this strike the panel? Would you like to speak to any of these points? Guy?
I just wanted to react very shortly to the Egyptian speaker said. I mean, I'm not Egyptian, but I'm observing very closely what's going on in your country because this is absolutely decisive for the whole Arab world. Okay, and which strikes me in Egypt that all the debate is focusing on democracy, and nobody is talking about the economy. And if we look at the very beginning of the movement, how it started in Tunisia, it started with a poor, frustrated guy who couldn't find a job, okay? And which makes me a bit fearful about Egypt right now is the absence of debate about the economy. And the absence of debate is very much, as you know, comes from the fact that the military are ready to relinquish political power, but not the economic monopolies. And I think the democracy in the Arab world has a future when the economic question will be really on the table, and when you will open your economy and when the military will relinquish economic power. And this is not only true in Egypt, it's true everywhere. And democracy will succeed, and your country will succeed only if you open the market.
Okay. Anyway,
I think we'll have a session on the Arab revolutions. No?
Well, that's right. I mean, part of our problem is obviously we got started a bit late, so I just want to. No, it's no one's fault. God knows, it's certainly not your fault. But we've got about 6, 7, 8 minutes. That's about it. So I think everyone on the panel also wanted to respond. So why don't we do that, and then we'll bring it to a close. So Heather, go ahead.
I was just going to respond very briefly to James Scher's point about democracy versus liberal democracy, and particularly the question of the liberal consensus. And I mean liberal with a small L and not in the American sense. Liberal in the European sense, which is a good deal more neutral and sort of centre ground. But the post-war liberal consensus in Europe, which has structured a lot of European politics and has driven policies, institutions at national level and at EU level that have seemed very strong and have seemed to guarantee democracy, I think it's under enormous threat now. It's under threat from several sides. One is just demographic change and also generational change. If you look at surveys of younger voters under 30s, it's extraordinary how they still hold some of the values of liberalism dear in their lives. For example, the idea of fairness, in fact, the idea of anti-corruption, as we've been saying. These things are popular causes, but they don't have much respect for the institutions and the laws which are needed in order to preserve those values. So there's a lack of trust in, for example, the judiciary. Actually, the judiciary is trusted less in most European countries now than the police, which I find remarkable. Not in France, it's the other way around in France, but in many other countries, which is an amazing thing. There's a sense that liberal elites are responsible for immigration, for globalization, for the crisis as well. You know, I saw one vox pop of a disgruntled 28-year-old who said, well, look, you screwed up this Euro project that was your idea. How can I trust you on immigration policy, which matters to me? So the euro crisis has a much bigger effect beyond economic policy. It brings the competence of elites, the competence of the political class into disrepute in Europe. And given that there was falling trust in institutions generally, then it's very difficult to rally people around liberal values if you don't then have support for the institutions which are needed to keep them there. And I think that's the problem we now have with liberal democracy. We could actually start on an analysis of the United States as well, but I won't go into that. Others, I'm sure, will talk about that later. But the idea that we can take liberalism for granted, I think that's a very dangerous view. There's a great deal of complacency about it, and I see that working in Brussels. Oh, yes, it'll always be there, it always has been. Not necessarily. And this is something that is not, which doesn't really have a strong momentum behind it. And okay, I work for the Open Society Foundations. It's quite hard to find supporters of the Open Society. People like living in one, but they don't necessarily want to do the things and vote for the things that will keep societies open.
Very good. Tom, did you want to?
Just to respond quickly also to James Scher. I mean, basically we have political parties that are either liberal democratic or social democratic. When we speak in Estonia, at least given our tradition, about democracy, we mean explicitly liberal democracy, as we know, and in the sense of how a country is governed, basically any kind of adjective before the word democracy means it's not liberal democracy, at least in our understanding. In the expression that Lilia probably coined, but managed democracy is to democracy like electric chair is to chair. We don't really accept any kind of epithets. But on the other hand, someone there back there, I don't know who it was, but basically, I actually do see corruption as the biggest threat to democracy. Not only corruption from, one country or another, but in general. The case in Italy, which I mentioned. The golden parachute of immense proportions as a result of the Nord Stream connection. Let's face it, that was corruption pure and simple, just no one wants to talk about it because it's so embarrassing. And we can find, at lower levels the same thing, and I think that's a real threat to European democracy. And they also tried to get Secretary Evans back during the Bush administration, but Gazprom tried to get him on board, and he said no. But let's face it, there are you have a kleptocratic regime in bed and probably inseparable from a company that is buying up politicians. That is a real threat.
A ministry.
What?
Which used to be a ministry.
Which used to be a ministry. And then Mr. Schroeder said, oh, it's just a private company. I mean, basically, this is a serious problem that we face, and the amounts of money that are in certain industries, especially oil and gas, are so huge that, I mean, people are sorely tempted. And in the case of, I mean, if you have, people at those levels, large countries in the EU, their prime ministers going for deals, that's worrisome.
David, last word.
To our Egyptian friend, if I may, I wasn't saying Egypt was going to follow a Saudi model. I was simply citing the Pew poll that said 61% of Egyptians favored a Saudi model. At the same time, roughly the same percentage has come out specifically for free speech, for free press, and perhaps even most importantly, equal rights for women. How that gels with the Saudi model, I just don't know. The poll overall is positive. Egyptians are still upbeat. I was particularly struck that only 21% of Egyptians in this poll think that there are foreign hands behind the protests that have taken place, which suggests that the efforts to go after organizations like mine really aren't working. Faisal Bulnaga thought she was playing a popular game. She actually was the lowest ranking politician that was surveyed in this Pew survey. So I don't think Egypt is going to follow a Saudi model. Egypt, as you rightly said, Egypt's going to follow an Egyptian model. It's going to be, I think, confusing. There are going to be stops and starts. I think we'll have to agree to disagree about the role that the SCAF has played. I don't think they played a very good role. And nevertheless, Egypt had good parliamentary elections. Put aside what one thinks about the result. Those who observed the elections, my organization wasn't one of them. The two organizations from the U.S. that did observe were then raided during the second round, unfortunately, IRI and NDI, but they thought the elections went well. So that's why I would argue, not with you, but I would say that it is much too early to write Egypt off. It's far too early in this process and the transition that it's going through. And not to get too wrapped up in one Pew survey, it is a pretty upbeat survey that gives some hope, I think.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's a big topic. I hope we ventilated it a bit. It seems clear there are challenges both to democracy and to capitalism, and they're interrelated. I want to thank you for your patience, and if you could just join me in thanking the panel, that would be great. Thank you.